He looked like any other drifter seeking shelter from the storm, but the two women watching him from the window had been waiting for someone exactly like him. Royce Barrett pulled his horse to a stop outside the weathered boarding house, rain hammering against his worn leather coat. The sign hanging crooked above the porch read, "Magnolia's Rest," in faded letters. Through the yellow glow of the windows, he could see movement inside. The silhouettes of two figures that seemed to pause when they noticed him. Thunder cracked overhead as he dismounted, his boots sinking into the muddy ground. Every muscle in his body ached from 3 days of hard riding. All he wanted was a dry bed and a hot meal before continuing his journey north. The storm had caught him miles from the nearest town, and this isolated boarding house was his only option. He thought about the job waiting for him in Copper Ridge. Decent pay for breaking horses on a cattle ranch. Nothing fancy, but honest work that would keep him fed through winter. The money in his saddlebags would get him there, assuming he could find somewhere safe to rest tonight. As he approached the porch, the front door swung open before he could knock. A woman in her 40s stood in the doorway, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a simple blue dress that had seen better days. Her smile was warm, but there was something in her eyes that made him pause, a flicker of excitement that seemed odd for someone greeting a stranger on a stormy night. "Well, aren't you a sight for sore eyes?" she said, stepping aside to welcome him in. "I'm Magnolia, but everyone calls me Maggie. Come in out of that weather before you catch your death." The interior was modest but clean, with a small parlor area and a narrow staircase leading to the second floor. A young woman with blonde hair sat in a rocking chair by the fireplace, her hands busy with needlework. She looked up when he entered, her pale blue eyes wide, with what appeared to be nervousness. "This here's Birdie," Maggie continued, gesturing toward the younger woman. "She helps me run the place. We don't get many travelers through here, especially not in weather like this." Royce removed his hat, water dripping onto the wooden floor. Something felt off about their eagerness to help him, but the warmth of the fire and the promise of dry clothes were too tempting to ignore. He'd learned to trust his instincts on the trail, but fatigue was clouding his judgment. "Much obliged, ma'am. Name's Royce Barrett. I can pay for a room and a meal." Birdie's needlework slipped from her hands, and she quickly bent to retrieve it. When she straightened, her face had gone even paler, but what Royce didn't notice was the way Birdie's eyes darted toward a closed door at the back of the house, or how Maggie's smile never quite reached her eyes. The stew was too salty, and Birdie kept glancing at the back door like she expected someone to walk through it. But Royce was too hungry to care about the strange behavior of his hosts. Maggie bustled around the small kitchen, ladling the thick brown stew into a chipped ceramic bowl. The smell of beef and vegetables filled the air, though something underneath it struck him as odd. A bitter scent he couldn't quite place. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him he hadn't eaten since dawn. "You look like you've been riding hard," Maggie observed, setting the bowl in front of him at the small wooden table. "Where you headed, if you don't mind me asking?" Royce picked up the spoon, his hand trembling slightly from exhaustion. "Copper Ridge. Got work waiting for me there." He took a bite of the stew, wincing at the salt content, but forcing himself to swallow. Beggars couldn't be choosers, especially in weather like this. Birdie had returned to her needlework, but her fingers fumbled with the thread. She'd been stealing glances at him since he sat down, and now she seemed to be having trouble concentrating on her work. The needle slipped, pricking her finger, and she let out a small gasp. "Careful there," Maggie said sharply, though her tone suggested more irritation than concern. "Can't afford to get blood on Mrs. Henderson's tablecloth." The name meant nothing to Royce, but he noticed how Birdie flinched at the mention of it. She pressed her bleeding finger to her lips and nodded quickly, returning to her sewing with renewed focus. Outside, the storm was intensifying. Wind howled around the building, rattling the windows and causing the oil lamps to flicker. The isolation of this place was becoming more apparent with each gust. They were miles from anywhere, and no one would be traveling these roads tonight. "This is mighty kind of you ladies," Royce said between spoonfuls. Not many folks would open their doors to a stranger in weather like this. Maggie's laugh was high and forced. "Oh, we believe in hospitality out here. A traveler's always welcome at Magnolia's Rest." She moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "Besides, it gets lonely with just the two of us. Nice to have some company for a change." Something in her voice didn't match her words. There was an undercurrent of anticipation, like she was waiting for something to happen. Royce found himself studying her more carefully as he ate. Her dress was well maintained despite its age, and her hands were soft, not the rough, work-worn hands he'd expect from someone running a remote boarding house. The stew was settling heavy in his stomach, and he was beginning to feel drowsy. The warmth of the fire and the exhaustion of the trail were catching up with him faster than expected. He blinked hard, trying to shake off the fatigue. "Room's upstairs, second door on the right," Maggie said, though he hadn't asked yet. "Clean sheets and a soft bed. You'll sleep like the dead." Bertie's needle slipped again, and this time she didn't try to hide her sharp intake of breath. But as Royce pushed back from the table, his legs felt strangely unsteady, and he couldn't shake the feeling that sleep might be the last thing he should be thinking about right now. The room was too clean for a place that rarely saw visitors, and the previous guest had left behind more than just wrinkled sheets. Royce gripped the banister as he climbed the narrow stairs, each step requiring more effort than it should. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, and he had to pause halfway up to steady himself. Something was wrong with his body. His vision was starting to blur around the edges, and his thoughts felt thick and sluggish. He thought it was just exhaustion from the trail, but the symptoms were coming on too fast, too strong. Behind him, he could hear Maggie and Bertie whispering in urgent, hushed tones, their voices too low to make out the words. The second door on the right opened to reveal a small but tidy room with a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a single window that rattled with each gust of wind. Everything appeared freshly cleaned, the floor swept, the bed made with tight corners, the wash basin gleaming in the lamplight. Too clean for a room that should have been gathering dust if they truly received few visitors. Royce set his saddlebags on the floor and sat heavily on the edge of the bed. His head was spinning now, and he had to close his eyes to fight off a wave of nausea. Whatever was happening to him, it wasn't natural fatigue. He'd been drugged before by claim jumpers in Colorado, and this felt eerily similar. Fighting through the growing fog in his mind, he forced himself to stand and examine the room more carefully. That's when he saw it, a gleam of metal under the bed barely visible in the lamplight. He dropped to one knee, his coordination clumsy, and reached underneath. His fingers closed around cold steel. A knife, but not just any knife. It was a bone-handled blade with distinctive carving on the grip. He'd seen this knife before, 3 weeks ago in Silver Creek, carried by a cattle buyer named Morrison, who'd been heading south with a significant amount of cash. Morrison had never made it to his destination. More searching revealed other items hastily shoved under the bed and behind the washstand. A silver pocket watch, a pair of expensive leather gloves, and a small leather pouch that still held a few gold coins. Personal effects from travelers who had stayed in this room and never left. The whispers from downstairs had stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps on the front porch. Heavy boots. Multiple sets, approaching the house through the storm. Royce's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. Maggie and Bertie weren't just robbing their guests. They were feeding them to accomplices, men who would handle the final, brutal details. His hands shaking from whatever drug they'd slipped into his food. Royce fumbled for his gun. The room was spinning faster now, and he could barely keep his eyes focused. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of lantern light moving around the side of the building. But as the front door opened downstairs, and unfamiliar voices joined the conversation, Royce realized he was trapped in a room that had become a tomb for other travelers, and his time was running out faster than his fading consciousness could handle. 3 men had arrived, and from their conversation drifting up through the floorboards, Royce learned they weren't here for coffee and conversation. "He's a big one," came a gravelly voice from below. "Gonna be more work than the last fellow." Royce pressed his ear to the floor, fighting against the drug coursing through his system. The wooden planks were old and warped, allowing sound to carry between floors. What he heard made his blood turn to ice water. Found nearly $200 in his saddlebags. Maggie's voice was different now, harder, businesslike. Gone was the warm hospitality she'd shown him earlier. Plus whatever he's got on his person, not bad for a night's work. A different man spoke up, younger sounding. "What about the girl? She's getting jumpy again. Nearly stuck herself with that needle twice tonight." "Bertie knows what happens if she causes problems," Maggie replied coldly. "She learned her lesson with the merchant from Tucson." Royce's vision was deteriorating rapidly, but adrenaline was helping him think more clearly despite the drug. He forced himself to move, crawling toward his saddlebags with painful slowness. His fingers found the hidden compartment he'd sewn into the leather, the place where he kept his real purpose for traveling these roads. Inside was a badge. United States Marshal. He'd been tracking this very operation for 3 months, following reports of missing travelers along this route. Morrison, the cattle buyer whose knife was under the bed, had been carrying information about suspected safe houses. This boarding house had been on the list. The floorboards creaked as heavy footsteps climbed the stairs. Royce managed to get his gun clear of its holster, though his hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip it. The room was tilting sideways, and he had to brace himself against the wall to remain upright. "Should be out cold by now," the gravelly voice was saying. "Maggie's special recipe works fast." But Royce had built up a tolerance to certain substances during his years of undercover work. The drug was affecting him, but not as quickly or completely as they expected. It was his only advantage, and a slim one at that. The door handle turned slowly. Through his blurred vision, Royce could see the brass knob rotating. He positioned himself behind the door, knowing he'd only get one chance. His coordination was shot, but desperation was a powerful motivator. The door swung open and a large man stepped into the room, lantern in one hand and a length of rope in the other. Behind him, a second figure waited in the hallway. They were expecting to find an unconscious victim, not an armed and aware target. "Where the hell?" the big man started to say as he noticed the empty bed. Royce struck with all the strength he could muster, bringing the gun down hard on the back of the man's skull. The lantern crashed to the floor, oil spreading across the wooden planks as flames began to lick at the dry boards. The second man in the hallway shouted an alarm, and suddenly the house erupted in chaos. Footsteps pounded on the stairs, voices called out orders, and the smell of smoke began to fill the air. But as Royce staggered toward the window, his legs finally giving out beneath him, he realized the fire spreading across the floor might be his salvation or his death sentence. And right now it was impossible to tell which. The flames were spreading faster than the men could reach him, but Royce's escape plan was about to become a death trap. Smoke filled the room as the spilled oil fed the fire across the old wooden floor. Royce crawled toward the window, his body betraying him with each movement. The drug was winning its battle against his consciousness, but the heat and smoke were forcing him to stay alert. Behind him, he could hear men shouting and boots thundering up the stairs. "The whole place is going up," someone yelled from the hallway. "Get him out before we lose everything." But the fire was creating a barrier between Royce and his pursuers. The flames had caught the bedsheets and were climbing the walls with hungry intensity. Through the growing smoke, he could see orange light dancing across the ceiling as the blaze found new fuel in the old timber. Using the wall for support, Royce hauled himself to his feet and fumbled with the window latch. His fingers felt thick and clumsy, barely able to work the simple mechanism. The glass was hot to the touch, warmed by the fire spreading through the room. Below, he could see the porch roof, a 12-foot drop to wooden shingles, then another drop to the muddy ground. The window finally gave way, swinging open to let in a rush of cold, rain-soaked air. The storm was still raging, but the fresh air helped clear some of the fog from his mind. He could hear voices below, more men gathering around the building, probably to catch him if he tried to escape this way. "He's at the window," Bertie's voice cut through the night from somewhere below. "Don't let him get away." But as Royce prepared to climb through the window, he heard something that made him pause. Behind the shouting and crackling of flames, there was another sound, a woman crying. Not Maggie's voice, but Bertie's, and she wasn't crying from fear or excitement. These were sobs of genuine anguish. "Please," she was calling out, "I never wanted this. They made me do it. They have my sister." The revelation hit Royce like a physical blow. Bertie wasn't a willing participant in this operation. She was being coerced. The nervous behavior, the fumbling with her needlework, the way she'd flinched when Maggie spoke sharply to her. She was as much a victim as the travelers who died in this room. Flames were now licking at the doorframe, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Royce could see figures moving in the hallway through the smoke, but the fire was keeping them at bay for now. He had to make a choice: escape through the window and leave Bertie to whatever fate awaited her, or try to help someone who might be the key to bringing down this entire operation. But as a burning beam crashed down behind him, blocking the doorway completely, Royce realized his choice was being made for him, and the window was looking less like an escape route and more like his only chance at survival. The porch roof held his weight for exactly 3 seconds before the rotted shingles gave way, sending him crashing into the mud below. Royce hit the ground hard, his shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. Pain shot through his body, but the cold rain and shock of the fall were helping to burn through some of the drug's effects. He could think more clearly now, though his coordination was still compromised. Around him, Men were shouting orders and running toward his position. Rolling behind a water barrel, he tried to assess the situation. The boarding house was fully engulfed now, flames shooting from the upstairs windows and licking at the roof. In the orange glow of the fire, he could see at least 4 men moving around the building, the 2 who'd come upstairs, plus others who must have been waiting outside. But where were Maggie and Bertie? Through the chaos, he spotted them near the back of the house. Maggie was dragging Bertie away from the building, the younger woman struggling against her grip. Even from a distance, Royce could see that Bertie was fighting to get away, not from the fire, but from Maggie herself. "Stop fighting me, you little fool." Maggie's voice carried over the noise of the storm and crackling flames. "We need to get to the horses before this whole place comes down." A gunshot rang out, and splinters exploded from the water barrel inches from Royce's head. One of the men had spotted him. He returned fire, though his aim was off due to the lingering effects of the drug. The shot went wide, but it bought him a few seconds to move to better cover behind a woodpile. The fire was spreading to other buildings now, a small barn and what looked like a storage shed. Whatever operation they were running here, it was being consumed by the flames Royce had accidentally started. Years of evidence, along with the belongings of countless victims, were turning to ash. Through the smoke and confusion, he heard Bertie scream. Not from fear, but from pain. Maggie had struck her, hard enough to drop the young woman to her knees in the mud. The older woman was shouting something about teaching lessons and knowing one's place. That's when Royce understood the full scope of what was happening here. This wasn't just a robbery operation, it was a network. Maggie was in charge. The men were her enforcers, and Bertie was being held against her will. The mention of her sister suggested they were using family members as leverage to ensure cooperation. Fighting through his impaired coordination, Royce made his way around the burning building, using the chaos and smoke as cover. He needed to reach Bertie before they got her to the horses. She was the key to understanding how large this operation was and who else might be involved. Another gunshot split the night, this one closer. A man emerged from the smoke to his left, rifle raised. Royce's return shot was true this time, dropping the man instantly, but the exchange had given away his position, and he could hear boots running toward him through the mud. The storm was intensifying, making visibility even worse, but it was also masking his movements. As he reached the corner of the burning house, he could see Maggie forcing Bertie toward a group of horses tied behind the storage shed. But what Royce saw next made his blood run cold. There were more horses than men, suggesting other members of this gang who hadn't shown themselves yet, and they were probably moving to surround him even now. The last man standing wasn't who Royce expected, and the truth about Bertie's sister would change everything he thought he knew about this night. Royce moved through the smoke and rain, his head finally clearing as the adrenaline burned away the last effects of the drug. The fire had consumed most of the boarding house, casting dancing shadows that helped conceal his approach toward the horses. 2 of the gang members were down, but he could hear at least one more moving through the darkness. As he rounded the storage shed, he found Maggie attempting to boost Bertie onto a horse. The young woman was fighting with surprising strength, clawing at Maggie's face and refusing to mount. In the firelight, Royce could see blood on both women, some from the struggle, some from the cuts Bertie had given herself with the sewing needle earlier. "Federal Marshal," Royce called out, his gun trained on Maggie. "Let her go and step away from the horses." Maggie spun around, her face twisted with rage and desperation. "You have no idea what you've done. This operation feeds a dozen families across 3 territories." But it was Bertie who spoke next, her voice cutting through the storm with unexpected authority. "She's lying, Marshal. This isn't about families. It's about greed. Pure and simple." Something in Bertie's tone made Royce look at her more carefully. The nervous, fumbling girl from earlier was gone, replaced by someone with steel in her voice and clarity in her eyes. She was no longer trembling or acting helpless. "My name is Ruth Caldwell," she continued, pulling something from inside her dress, a badge identical to Royce's own. "Deputy U.S. Marshal, working undercover for the past 2 months." The revelation hit Royce like lightning. There had been no sister being held hostage, no coercion keeping Bertie compliant. She had been playing a role, gathering evidence on the operation from the inside. The nervous behavior, the fumbling with needlework, all of it had been an act to maintain her cover. Maggie's face went white as she realized she'd been harboring a federal agent all along. "You little witch!" she snarled, reaching for a gun hidden beneath her apron. But Ruth was faster. Her shot took Maggie in the shoulder, spinning the older woman around and sending her weapon flying into the mud. At the same moment, Royce heard movement behind him and turned to find the last gang member emerging from the smoke. Rifle raised. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. The gang member dropped, Ruth's second bullet finding its mark. The operation that had claimed the lives of dozens of travelers was finally over, ended in fire and rain on a night that had started with such simple intentions. As the flames died down and the storm began to clear, Royce and Ruth stood among the ashes of Magnolia's Rest. The evidence they'd gathered would help connect this operation to similar crimes across the territory, bringing justice for victims whose families had never learned their fate. "I never wanted anyone else to walk into this trap," Ruth said, looking at the destruction around them. "Every night I had to watch them plan for the next victim, knowing I couldn't blow my cover until I had enough evidence to stop all of them." Royce understood the weight she'd been carrying. "You saved my life tonight. If you hadn't been here, you would have figured it out," she replied with a slight smile. "Marshals have a way of surviving the impossible." The horses were loaded with stolen goods from countless victims. Money, jewelry, personal effects that could finally be returned to grieving families. Maggie, wounded but alive, would stand trial for her crimes along with any surviving members of her network. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, 2 federal marshals rode toward town with their prisoner and evidence of crimes that had terrorized the territory for years. What had started as a simple search for shelter had become the end of a reign of terror that stretched across hundreds of miles. In the end, Royce had gotten what he originally wanted, a place to rest for the night. He just hadn't expected that rest to come after the most dangerous night of his career. Sometimes the best shelter isn't found in buildings, but in the partnership of those who share the burden of protecting others. The trail to Copper Ridge would have to wait. There was more work to be done, more justice to serve, and more travelers who deserved to make their journeys safely. But for now, the road ahead looked a little brighter, and the dangers a little more manageable, knowing there were others like Ruth fighting the same fight. If you enjoyed this tale of justice in the Old West, please consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us with a super chat if you'd like to hear more stories like this one. Your support helps us bring these forgotten tales of courage and survival to light. Click on the next video to discover another gripping story from the American frontier.